Imagine the dust of the Levant rising under thousands of hooves, the sun beating mercilessly on the bronze helmets of warriors, and a pharaoh leading his men into what would become one of the most decisive yet strangely forgotten battles of antiquity. The year is 1457 BCE, and the place is Megiddo, a fortified city in what is now northern Israel. The ruler is Pharaoh Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt for his unmatched military genius. His story is written on temple walls, yet the world rarely pauses to consider how this single battle shaped the destiny of Egypt as the undisputed power of the ancient Near East. To understand Megiddo, we must first picture the world in which it happened. Egypt had long been the mighty kingdom on the Nile, with influence stretching into Canaan and Syria. But Egyptian control over these territories was never unquestioned. Local Canaanite princes grew restless, and under the leadership of the king of Kadesh, a coalition of city-states rose in defiance. Their alliance was not trivial. If successful, it would have severed Egypt's trade networks, cut off access to vital resources like timber and metals, and perhaps pushed Egypt back into isolation. Thutmose III, still in the early years of his reign, faced his first great test. The Egyptian army marched north, a logistical feat in itself. Ancient records suggest it may have been around 20,000 men strong, a mixture of archers, infantry, and the pride of the Egyptian military, chariots. These were not the heavy, lumbering machines of later centuries, but light, swift vehicles pulled by pairs of horses, perfectly suited for speed and maneuverability. The march was grueling, through deserts and over rugged terrain, but the real drama came when the Egyptian forces reached the outskirts of Megiddo. The coalition of Canaanite rulers had taken up positions near the city, guarding the roads. There were 3 possible routes for the Egyptians to approach. 2 were wide and safe but heavily guarded. The third, through the narrow mountain pass at Aruna, was dangerous and easily ambushed. Thutmose's generals urged caution, recommending the longer, safer routes. But the young pharaoh saw something his advisors did not. If he took the risky path, the enemy would never expect him. He chose audacity over caution. The decision was daring, almost reckless. The Egyptian army squeezed through the narrow Aruna Pass, single file, horses and chariots struggling up steep inclines. If the Canaanites had anticipated this, the entire force could have been annihilated in a trap. But fortune favored Thutmose. By the time the Egyptians emerged onto the plain beyond, they had the element of surprise. The Canaanite coalition scrambled to respond, expecting Egypt from a different direction entirely. The battle itself unfolded on the fertile fields before the city. The Egyptians fanned out, their chariots forming swift-moving wings while infantry pressed the center. Bronze-tipped arrows rained across the plain. The Canaanites, though numerous, were caught in disarray. Thutmose himself took to the field, his chariot gleaming, recorded later in temple inscriptions as a divine figure leading his men to glory. The Egyptian charge broke enemy lines, sending the coalition into chaotic retreat. But it was not a quick or easy victory. The Canaanite princes fled into the fortified walls of Megiddo itself, slamming the gates behind them. And here is where Thutmose made another decision that would define the outcome. Instead of wasting lives in a direct assault against strong fortifications, he laid siege. The Egyptians cut off supplies, encircled the city, and waited. For 7 months, the Canaanite leaders were trapped. Their people starved, morale collapsed, and finally, the gates opened. Megiddo fell not just by force, but by patience and strategy. The consequences of this victory rippled across the region. With the fall of Megiddo, the Canaanite rebellion collapsed. Egypt reasserted dominance over the Levant, securing trade routes and cementing Thutmose III's reputation as a brilliant commander. This was not a mere border skirmish, it was the moment Egypt transitioned from a powerful kingdom to a true empire, stretching influence deeper into the Near East than ever before. For the next 2 decades, Thutmose would campaign further north, even reaching the Euphrates, bringing unimaginable wealth and tribute back to Thebes. And yet, despite its importance, the Battle of Megiddo is strangely forgotten outside specialist circles. Why? Perhaps because it occurred so early in history, over 3,000 years ago, its memory locked away in hieroglyphs carved into the temple of Ammonius at Karnak. Unlike later wars chronicled in Greek epics or Roman histories, Megiddo lacked poets to immortalize it. The records that survive are more matter-of-fact, listing captured horses, weapons, and spoils. Without a Homer to sing its glory, Megiddo faded from popular imagination. But historians know its importance. In fact, it is often considered the world's first battle recorded with reliable detail. The inscriptions tell us not just of victory, but of logistics, tactics, and even the political calculations of the pharaoh. It represents the dawn of military history as we understand it. When modern generals study strategy, the lessons of surprise, maneuver, and siege at Megiddo are still relevant. There is also something haunting in the way Megiddo resonates with the future. The very name Megiddo has echoed through time, reappearing centuries later in the biblical Armageddon, the prophesied site of the final apocalyptic battle. It is as if this small city, perched on a strategic crossroads, was destined to be remembered not for what truly happened, but for a mythical war that never came. The real battle, the one that gave birth to empire, remains hidden in the shadows of prophecy and forgotten by the masses. To bring it alive, imagine standing on those plains today. The fields are quiet, green with crops, but beneath your feet lies the soil that once drank the blood of thousands. The same hills that saw chariots racing under a blazing sun now watch tourists with cameras. Few of them realize they walk the stage where Egypt secured its golden age. The Battle of Megiddo was more than a clash of armies, it was a statement of power, a demonstration of daring leadership, and a turning point in the story of empire. Thutmose III emerged not just as a survivor, but as a conqueror destined to expand Egypt to its furthest boundaries. And though the textbooks often skim over this confrontation, it stands as one of the earliest examples of how a single battle can alter the destiny of nations. Forgotten by many, Megiddo was the spark that lit Egypt's imperial flame. When people think of the Persian Wars, two images usually dominate the imagination. The first is the heroic last stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, their shields raised against impossible odds. The second is the sudden, thunderous Greek victory at the naval battle of Salamis, where wooden triremes rammed and splintered Persian ships. Both are iconic, carved into the collective memory as moments of defiance and triumph. But there was another battle, less celebrated, rarely mentioned outside academic circles, that truly sealed the fate of Greece and, some argue, of Western civilization itself. This was the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, the final confrontation that broke the back of the Persian invasion and ensured that Greece would remain free to chart its own course. To understand Plataea, we must step back. In 480 BCE, Xerxes I, the great king of Persia, had launched one of the largest invasions the ancient world had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, fleets stretching across the horizon, a war machine meant to crush the fractious Greek city-states once and for all. Thermopylae had slowed the advance but ended in heroic slaughter. Athens itself had been burned to ashes. Salamis was a stunning naval victory, but the Persian land army still remained in Greece, vast and threatening, encamped and ready. Victory at sea did not guarantee survival on land. Everything still hung in the balance. By the spring of 479 BCE, Xerxes had returned to Persia, leaving his trusted general Mardonius in command of a formidable force. The Persians set up camp in central Greece, using Thebes, a city allied with Persia, as their base. From there, Mardonius sought to divide the Greek alliance, offering peace terms to Athens if they would abandon Sparta. The Athenians, though their city lay in ruins, refused. The Greeks rallied once more. Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians, and smaller city-states assembled a coalition army and marched north. Their target, the Persian camp near the small city of Plataea in Boeotia. What followed was not a swift clash but a tense standoff. For over a week, the two armies maneuvered and countermaneuvered across the Asopus River plain. The Greeks had assembled around 40,000 hoplites, heavily armored infantry, and tens of thousands of supporting troops. The Persians, though perhaps fewer in number than the Greeks claimed, still boasted a force of nearly 70,000, including their feared cavalry. Day after day, Mardonius sent his horsemen to harass the Greek positions, cutting supply lines, sowing chaos, and killing water-bearers. The Greeks, disciplined but cautious, refused to be baited into crossing the river and attacking the fortified Persian camp. The tension reached breaking point when the Greeks, suffering from lack of supplies, decided to shift their positions under cover of night. But communication broke down, and the retreat looked more like a disorderly scattering. Sensing weakness, Mardonius seized his chance. He ordered a full assault. Persian cavalry thundered across the plain, infantry followed, and suddenly, the final showdown was underway. The Athenians held one flank, the Spartans the other. The Persians pressed hard, confident that the disorganized Greek retreat had handed them victory. But here, the discipline of the hoplite phalanx, the dense wall of spear and shield, proved decisive. Spartan soldiers locked into formation, their bronze shields glinting, their long spears bristling forward. Persian infantry, lightly armored with wicker shields and short spears, found themselves outmatched in close combat. The clash was brutal, hand to hand, spear against spear, shield against sword. At the heart of the battle was Mardonius himself. Unlike Xerxes, who had watched Salamis from a golden throne, Mardonius fought among his men, armored in dazzling white, mounted on a great horse. But bravery could not overcome discipline. A Spartan spear found its mark, and Mardonius fell dead. The sight of their general slain shattered Persian morale. Panic rippled through their ranks, and the great army of Asia broke. The Greeks surged forward, cutting them down, driving them back toward their camp. But even then, the fighting was not over. The Persians retreated behind wooden barricades hastily constructed around their camp. What followed was a siege within a battle. At first, the Greeks struggled to breach the defenses, but once the Athenians forced a gap, the floodgates opened. Hoplites poured inside, slaughtering the defenders. The Persian camp became a killing ground. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of Persians lay dead, their empire's ambitions in Greece buried with them. The aftermath was profound. Plataea was not just a Greek victory, it was the decisive victory. It ended the Persian invasion once and for all. No longer could the great kings threaten the independence of the Greek city-states. In the very same year, at the naval battle of Mycale off the coast of Asia Minor, the Greek fleet destroyed the remnants of the Persian navy. Together, these victories shifted the balance of power. Greece had survived. Athens would rise from its ashes to build an empire of culture and philosophy, Sparta would remain a military power, and the legacy of democratic thought, art, and science that grew from this soil would shape the future of the West. And yet, when we talk about the Persian Wars, Plataea is rarely the headline. Thermopylae, with its tragic heroism, captures imagination. Salamis, with its naval brilliance, dominates the narrative. Plataea, though larger in scale and more decisive in outcome, is relegated to a footnote. Why? Perhaps because it lacked the romantic imagery of Leonidas' sacrifice or the drama of ships clashing at sea. Plataea was not a story of noble defeat or improbable victory, it was the grinding triumph of discipline, logistics, and unity. Less poetic, perhaps, but far more consequential. Today, the fields of Plataea are quiet. Olive trees grow where tens of thousands once fought and died. Villagers walk paths that were once rivers of blood. There are no grand monuments, no epic poems sung by bards, only the faint echo of spear on shield. But if you listen closely to history, you can still hear it, the moment when Greece, battered but unbroken, stood firm and secured its future. The Battle of Plataea reminds us that history is not always written around the battles we remember, but around the battles that mattered. Without Plataea, Thermopylae would have been nothing more than a tragic last stand, Salamis a fleeting reprieve. It was here, on the dusty plains of Boeotia, that the fate of Greece was sealed. Forgotten by many, but decisive for all. When we think of military genius, Hannibal Barca often rises to the top of the list. A Carthaginian commander, born into a world of ambition and war, he was a man who understood the psychology of battle as much as the mechanics. And yet, despite one of the most staggering tactical triumphs in history, Hannibal's greatest victory, Cannae, fought in 216 BCE, would eventually fade in public memory, eclipsed by Rome's eventual triumph. Picture southern Italy in the summer heat. The fields are dry, the air shimmering with dust, and the river valley stretches endlessly, waiting to witness carnage. Hannibal's army, though far from home, is composed of diverse peoples, fierce Numidian cavalry with light armor and deadly javelins, disciplined African and Iberian infantry, and mercenaries from across the western Mediterranean. Opposite them, the Roman Republic has mobilized one of its largest forces yet, perhaps 80,000 men, a mix of legions raised from across the Italian peninsula. Rome is confident, Hannibal is outnumbered. But this is precisely where Hannibal's brilliance shines. He does not attack in a straight line. Instead, he crafts a formation designed to lure, to deceive, and to annihilate. In the center, he arranges his infantry in a convex crescent, deliberately weak. The Romans, sensing opportunity, charge headlong into what appears to be a gap in the enemy line. Hannibal's plan is diabolically simple: allow the enemy to advance too far, then envelop them from both flanks with cavalry and infantry. The battlefield itself becomes a trap, a stage upon which strategy will outmatch brute force. As the Romans pressed forward, the Carthaginian center gradually recedes, a controlled withdrawal that pulls the attackers deeper into the deadly embrace. Numidian cavalry dart around the edges, harassing and distracting. On the flanks, Hannibal's heavier troops hold firm, keeping the Romans engaged but contained. Slowly, imperceptibly, the crescent begins to invert, forming a deadly noose. By mid-morning, the Roman advance is completely encircled. The soldiers who once believed themselves masters of the battlefield are trapped. Then the slaughter begins. Ancient sources describe scenes of unimaginable chaos. Spear meets shield, swords bite through armor, and the cries of men echo across the plains. The Romans attempt to break formation, but panic spreads faster than orders. Cavalry cut off escape routes. Infantry from the flanks crush those trying to flee. Horses trample soldiers, shields splinter, and the ground is churned into a morass of mud and blood. Hannibal, observing from a slight elevation, sees the fulfillment of a plan that has been months in the making, the greatest encirclement in military history. The casualties are staggering. Some estimates suggest 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers perished in a single day, the vast majority of the army. Carthaginian losses, by contrast, are astonishingly low, perhaps 6,000 men. Cannae becomes a textbook example of double envelopment, studied by generals for centuries. Napoleon called it the perfect battle, and yet, paradoxically, Hannibal did not march on Rome afterward. Logistics, exhaustion, and political caution prevented him from capitalizing fully. History, as it often does, would favor Rome in the end. The Battle of Cannae is a masterclass in tactical brilliance, but it also demonstrates the cruel irony of historical memory. Hannibal's genius is undeniable, yet Rome's survival allowed them to write the narrative. Polybius, Livy, and other Roman historians immortalized Roman valor while framing Hannibal as the outsider invader. The psychological trauma of Cannae haunted Rome for generations, leading to reforms in military strategy and the creation of the Fabian approach, avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal, harassing his forces, and waiting for attrition to do what Cannae could not. Cannae's legacy, however, extends beyond numbers and tactics. It serves as a study in leadership, innovation, and the consequences of hubris. Rome's overconfidence led to disaster, yet it was resilience, discipline, and the ability to learn from failure that ultimately ensured survival. Hannibal's brilliance remained legendary, inspiring future leaders like Scipio Africanus, Napoleon, and even modern military strategists. And yet, for the average person, Cannae is a footnote, overshadowed by Rome's eventual triumph at Zama 13 years later. The human element is as compelling as the military one. Consider the ordinary soldiers, thousands of men trapped in a killing ground. Their faces, etched with fear and determination, the sound of spears clashing and cries of comrades, the choking dust of a summer day, the human cost is staggering. And the civilians in nearby towns, hearing the distant thunder of battle, watching smoke rise and messengers flee, would later recount stories of horror, bravery, and survival. History rarely remembers them, yet their experience anchors the reality of war beyond the strategy books. Cannae also reshaped Roman thinking. Rome's obsession with numerical superiority, discipline, and legion structure was forged in the crucible of defeat. Every legion that marched afterward carried the lessons of that day. Never again would Rome underestimate an opponent. And so, paradoxically, Hannibal's victory sowed the seeds of the empire's later dominance. The greatest tactical triumph in history ultimately became a catalyst for the greatest political and military recovery. Today, the plains of Cannae are quiet farmland. Sheep graze where soldiers once fell, olive trees stretch across the landscape, and only subtle markers hint at the scale of bloodshed that occurred over 2 millennia ago. The battle lives on not in monuments, but in military studies, in whispered legends, and in the understanding that one day, strategy can overcome numbers, but only sometimes. Cannae is a story of brilliance, horror, and irony. Hannibal achieved a victory so complete that it should have rewritten history. Yet the world moves forward, often forgetting those who won but could not consolidate, remembering instead those who lost yet endured. It reminds us that history is as much about the stories we tell as the events that actually happened. And in that sense, Cannae remains a haunting testament to both the power and the tragedy of war. Europe in the early 8th century was a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and emerging powers, still recovering from the collapse of the Roman Empire. In the south, a tide of conquest was moving northward. The Umayyad Caliphate, which had swept across North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula, now sought to extend its reach into the heart of Frankish lands. Their armies were battle-hardened, their cavalry fast and deadly, and their reputation for conquest seemed unstoppable. But the fate of Western Europe was about to hinge on one confrontation, fought not in the glare of popular memory, but in the fields near a small town called Tours in central Gaul. The man tasked with defending Europe was Charles Martel, a Frankish leader whose nickname, the Hammer, would one day resonate across centuries. Unlike kings with ceremonial titles, Charles was a warrior and a strategist, a man who understood that the survival of his people depended not just on courage, but on preparation, discipline, and timing. His forces, composed of infantry drawn from Frankish peasants and nobles, were vastly outnumbered by the Umayyad cavalry. Yet Charles understood the terrain, the power of cohesion, and the importance of morale in a decisive battle. The two armies faced each other across the rolling plains near the city of Tours. The Umayyads, confident in their mobility and experience, expected a quick victory. The Frankish infantry formed a dense shield wall, their axes and spears bristling like a living fortification. Unlike the mobile cavalry of the Umayyads, the Franks relied on staying grounded, holding the line with relentless discipline. For hours, the two forces stared at one another, the tension in the air palpable. Dust rose from the dry soil, and the occasional clanging of armor punctuated the silence. The Umayyad cavalry struck first, charging repeatedly, expecting to break the Frankish lines with speed and shock. But Charles had anticipated this. The infantry held firm, planting their feet and meeting the cavalry with steadfast resistance. Horses crashed into walls of men, riders fell, and the shock of repeated attacks gradually began to erode the momentum of the invaders. The Franks countered with precise timing, letting the enemy commit to each charge before striking back, turning aggression into vulnerability. Hours turned into a grueling day of combat. Unlike romanticized single-hour battles, Tours was a slow grind, a war of endurance. Archers and skirmishers harried the edges of the battlefield, and Frankish leaders moved among their lines, rallying men who were sweating, bleeding, and exhausted. Every inch of ground was contested. The Umayyads, despite their cavalry advantage, began to falter. Confident assumptions about European troops being easy to scatter were shattered against the unyielding Frankish shield wall. Then, in a pivotal moment, Charles himself engaged directly with the enemy, leading a countercharge that broke the cohesion of the Umayyad lines. The invaders, who had advanced deep into Frankish territory, suddenly found themselves surrounded and cut off. Chaos replaced coordination, and the discipline that had defined their campaign crumbled under the weight of steady resistance. Thousands were killed or captured, while others retreated toward Iberia, their northern ambitions thwarted for decades. The consequences of Tours cannot be overstated. Europe, still fragile and vulnerable to external influence, had been protected from further Umayyad expansion. The Frankish realm emerged strengthened, and Charles Martel's authority grew. This victory laid the foundation for the rise of the Carolingian Empire and the eventual coronation of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor. Without Tours, the cultural, religious, and political trajectory of Europe could have been dramatically different. Latin Christendom might have faced far greater pressure, altering the development of Western civilization as we know it. Yet, despite its importance, Tours is often overshadowed in popular memory. Unlike Thermopylae or Waterloo, it lacks romanticized heroics or dramatic last stands. It is remembered as a decisive battle only for those who study the intricate threads of medieval history. Its significance is subtle but profound. The clash was less about glory and more about survival. It exemplifies how the fate of civilizations can pivot on moments of disciplined resistance rather than cinematic heroism. There is also a human dimension to consider. The ordinary Frankish soldiers, farmers and townsmen, fought not for empire or wealth, but to protect their homes and families. They faced elite cavalry, far more experienced and seasoned, yet their courage and cohesion held the line. The same could be said for the Umayyad soldiers, who charged across Europe with confidence, unaware that their advance would meet such resistance. The field of Tours was a crucible where determination, strategy, and circumstance combined to determine destiny. Modern historians often debate the exact scale of the battle, the size of the armies, and the casualties. Yet the essence of Tours remains clear. It was a moment when Europe's northern identity solidified, a turning point that allowed Western civilization to develop along its own trajectory, preserving cultures, languages, and political structures that continue to influence the modern world. Today, the fields near Tours are peaceful. Vineyards stretch across rolling hills, and small villages mark the landscape where once armies clashed. There are monuments, modest by comparison to later battlefields, but the echo of history lingers. The Battle of Tours is a quiet reminder that decisive moments do not always arrive with fanfare, and that the preservation of a civilization sometimes depends on the uncelebrated courage of those who simply refuse to yield. In the end, Tours stands as a testament to strategy, endurance, and the impact of a single decision, the choice to resist, to stand firm against overwhelming odds. Charles Martel's hammer did not just strike enemy cavalry, it struck a chord that would resonate throughout European history. Forgotten by many, yet decisive for all, the battle reminds us that history is shaped as much by hidden victories as by the celebrated ones. The 9th century in England was a time of turmoil and uncertainty. Viking longships had begun to appear on the horizon, their dark prows cutting through the North Sea as raiders, settlers, and conquerors sought fortune and land. These were not isolated raids. The great heathen army, composed of thousands of seasoned Norse warriors, moved across England with deadly purpose. Kingdoms fell one by one under the relentless assault. Towns were burned, monasteries plundered, and fear spread like wildfire. Yet amid the chaos, one man emerged to rally the English, Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great. Alfred was not a king of vast armies or inherited prestige. he was a ruler of a fragmented kingdom, beset on all sides by a superior enemy. The Vikings, led by Guthrum, had already claimed large swathes of territory in Mercia and East Anglia. Alfred's Wessex was one of the last standing strongholds of Anglo-Saxon resistance. His challenge was monumental: defeat the Viking army or see his kingdom swallowed entirely. But Alfred was more than a soldier, he was a strategist, a thinker, and a master of both diplomacy and war. The stage was set near Edington in 878 CE. Alfred had regrouped his forces after months of skirmishes and retreats, training men in the shield wall formation that would prove crucial. The Vikings, confident in their strength and experience, did not expect the English to stand so firmly after previous setbacks. Yet Alfred's careful planning allowed him to take the high ground, using terrain and the element of surprise to his advantage. The battle began in earnest when the Viking forces advanced, their axes flashing and shields gleaming under the sun. Alfred's men held formation, disciplined and resolute. Unlike previous engagements, the English did not flee or falter. They absorbed the Viking charges, countering with precise, coordinated strikes. The clash was intense, a brutal exchange of steel on steel, and the cries of men reverberated across the fields. For hours, neither side could gain the upper hand. But Alfred's strategy went beyond simple defense. He used deception and feints to mislead the Vikings, drawing portions of their army into traps while keeping his center strong. The English archers and infantry worked in tandem, harrying the Vikings on the flanks, cutting off reinforcements, and exploiting weaknesses. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Guthrum, expecting an easy victory, found his forces caught off balance, exposed to concentrated attacks from multiple directions. Eventually, the Viking lines broke. Many Norse warriors attempted to flee, but the English pursued relentlessly. Those who could not escape were captured, including key leaders, while Guthrum himself was cornered. Alfred's forces achieved what seemed impossible: they defeated a numerically superior, experienced Viking army. The victory at Edington was decisive, but Alfred's genius was in what followed. Rather than annihilating the Vikings entirely, he negotiated peace terms, including Guthrum's conversion to Christianity and the formal recognition of boundaries between Wessex and Viking-controlled territories. This diplomacy ensured long-term stability and prevented endless cycles of revenge and war. The significance of Edington goes far beyond the immediate battlefield. Alfred's victory secured the survival of Anglo-Saxon culture in southern England and prevented Norse domination. It laid the foundation for a unified England centuries later and ensured that the English language, legal systems, and Christian institutions could continue to develop uninterrupted. Without Edington, the political and cultural landscape of the British Isles might have been dramatically different. Yet, like many decisive battles, Edington is often overshadowed in popular memory. Vikings capture the imagination with tales of plunder and heroism, and Alfred is remembered more for his wisdom and legal reforms than for his military triumphs. The blood-soaked plains of Edington, where the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance, remain relatively obscure outside scholarly texts. But in its time, it was a battle that decided the trajectory of an entire people. There is also a human dimension to consider. Imagine Alfred and his soldiers, standing firm after months of hardship, aware that failure meant the end of their homeland. Picture the Norse warriors, seasoned by years of conquest, suddenly facing a disciplined and cunning opponent who refused to yield. The tension, fear, and courage on both sides remind us that history is composed not just of dates and names, but of real people confronting impossible odds. The victory at Edington also reshaped military tactics in England. Alfred's emphasis on disciplined formations, use of terrain, and strategic patience influenced generations of English commanders. It demonstrated that leadership, foresight, and morale could compensate for numerical inferiority, lessons that echo through military history to this day. Today, the fields near Edington are quiet, marked only by small memorials and the whispers of history. Sheep graze where once shields clashed and swords bit into armor. The rivers and hills that bore witness to Alfred's triumph now carry a serene calm, masking the violence and heroism of that fateful day. The Battle of Edington reminds us that history often remembers the invaders, the conquerors, or the legends, but the survival of a people can hinge on lesser-known battles fought with courage, strategy, and a profound sense of purpose. In the end, Edington stands as a testament to resilience, leadership, and the subtle but profound ways in which a single battle can shape the destiny of a nation. Alfred's hammer did more than defeat the Vikings, it safeguarded the future of England itself, a legacy often hidden in the shadows of more famous conflicts, yet decisive in the making of a kingdom. In the vast, open landscapes of Central Asia, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the wind carries whispers of ancient travelers, a battle unfolded that few today can pinpoint on a map, yet whose consequences shaped the course of civilizations. The year is 751 CE, and the stage is the banks of the Talas River, near what is now the border of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. On one side, the mighty Tang dynasty of China, a superpower of its era, known for its art, poetry, and imperial sophistication. On the other, the Abbasid Caliphate, a rising Islamic empire, brimming with ambition, cavalry, and the determination to expand westward. At first glance, Talas might seem just another clash of armies, a footnote in the chronicles of empires. But in reality, it was decisive, a moment where cultural, technological, and political trajectories were set for centuries to come. The Tang army, seasoned and disciplined, had advanced far from its heartland, seeking to assert influence over the rich trade routes of Central Asia. The Abbasids, aware of the stakes, mustered a coalition of local allies and trained soldiers, ready to resist the Chinese push and secure the wealth and prestige of the region. The battle began as armies arrayed across the river's floodplain, cavalry poised, infantry bracing. Tang forces, confident in their disciplined formations and superior numbers, pressed forward, expecting to assert dominance with precision and coordinated attacks. The Abbasids, however, had a secret advantage: knowledge of the terrain, local intelligence, and a crucial contingency of Turkic horsemen who knew the desert plains intimately. Early skirmishes tested the Tang lines, probing for weaknesses, while both sides jockeyed for advantageous positions under the relentless sun. What made Talas truly remarkable, and ultimately catastrophic for the Tang, was a betrayal within their ranks. Some allied Turkish mercenaries, initially positioned as support, switched allegiance mid-battle, attacking the Tang forces from behind. The disciplined Chinese troops, caught between frontal assaults and treachery in their rear, struggled to maintain cohesion. The Abbasid army seized the moment, pressing hard with cavalry charges that enveloped the Tang flanks. The clash was brutal and chaotic, the sound of steel on steel and the cries of men filled the air, mingling with the dust that rose like a curtain over the battlefield. The outcome was swift. Tang forces, despite their skill and discipline, were decisively defeated. Thousands fell, and many more were captured or forced to retreat toward China. The Abbasids claimed victory, not just on the battlefield, but in terms of long-term strategic influence. The immediate consequence was the halting of Chinese westward expansion. Central Asia, rich in trade routes and cultural exchange, would remain largely under Islamic influence, altering the trajectory of the Silk Road and the spread of civilizations along it. But the ripple effects of Talas went far beyond mere territorial control. One of the most enduring consequences was technological and cultural. It was here that papermaking techniques, previously a closely guarded Chinese secret, spread westward. Captured Chinese artisans introduced the art of papermaking to the Islamic world, which over time transformed education, bureaucracy, and culture across Persia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. In a sense, the defeat at Talas inadvertently accelerated the dissemination of knowledge, changing the intellectual landscape of the world for centuries to come. The battle also had subtle political repercussions. The Tang dynasty, already stretched thin by campaigns on multiple fronts, began to lose influence in Central Asia. The Abbasid Caliphate consolidated its control over the region, integrating local powers and securing critical trade arteries that would enrich its empire and stabilize its western borders. This clash, largely forgotten in popular memory, effectively reshaped the balance of power across Asia, ensuring that Islamic culture and political structures would dominate Central Asia for generations. What makes Talas especially compelling is the stark contrast between its scale and its obscurity. Here was a battle involving tens of thousands of soldiers, capable generals on both sides, and consequences that influenced the course of empires, yet it rarely appears in mainstream history textbooks. Unlike Thermopylae or Cannae, which are celebrated for their heroism or tactical brilliance, Talas is remembered primarily by historians who understand its long-term impact, rather than the immediate spectacle of combat. The human dimension of Talas is also striking. Imagine Chinese soldiers, far from home, fighting under a blazing sun, trying to maintain order amidst chaos and betrayal. Consider the Abbasid cavalry, striking with ferocity and precision, aware that victory would secure their empire's western frontier. And think of the civilians and traders along the Silk Road, whose lives and livelihoods would be forever influenced by the outcome of a battle they could never have imagined. Every sword swing, every tactical maneuver, rippled across continents and centuries. Today, the Talas River flows quietly, its waters shimmering under the Central Asian sun. Sheep graze where thousands of men once fought, and the wind carries no memory of the cries of battle, only the whisper of history waiting to be rediscovered. Talas reminds us that history is not always about the battles we know, but about those whose significance unfolds quietly, shaping cultures, technologies, and empires in ways often overlooked. The Battle of Talas stands as a testament to the power of strategy, the fragility of ambition, and the unpredictable ways in which history can pivot. A single clash, forgotten by many, determined the boundaries of influence, the flow of ideas, and even the dissemination of knowledge that would eventually reach Europe. It was, in every sense, a battle that decided the fate of nations, yet it remains hidden in the shadows of more famous conflicts. The Mongol Empire, in the mid-13th century, was a force unlike any the world had ever seen. From the steppes of Central Asia to the plains of Eastern Europe, Mongol horsemen swept across continents, leaving destruction and fear in their wake. Cities fell, empires crumbled, and the very concept of invincibility seemed to belong to these swift, ruthless warriors. Yet, in 1260 CE, the unstoppable advance of the Mongols met a force capable not only of resisting but of decisively defeating them. That place was Ain Jalut, in the Jordan Valley of present-day Israel, and the battle would alter the course of Middle Eastern history. To understand Ain Jalut, one must first grasp the fear inspired by the Mongols. In the preceding decades, they had conquered vast territories with terrifying speed. Baghdad fell in 1258, the Abbasid Caliphate was nearly annihilated, and the legendary Mongol horde seemed poised to sweep down into Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Their reputation for brutality was well-earned, entire cities destroyed, populations massacred, and survivors left to recount horror stories. Yet the Mamluks of Egypt, a military caste of former slaves turned warriors, were not ordinary defenders. They were disciplined, battle-hardened, and led by Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general, Baybars. The Mongol army that marched toward Ain Jalut was experienced, confident, and formidable, but it was also overextended. After decades of relentless conquest, supply lines were stretched across deserts and mountains, and the human cost of their campaigns had weakened their ranks. The Mamluks, by contrast, understood the terrain intimately and knew that a head-on confrontation would require both strategy and cunning. The stage was set, a confrontation that would test tactics, endurance, and leadership to the extreme. The battle began with careful maneuvers. The Mamluks avoided a simple frontal assault. Instead, they lured portions of the Mongol cavalry into traps, feigning retreats while hiding reserves to strike unexpectedly. The dust rose like clouds over the valley, concealing movements and heightening tension. Mongol horsemen, used to the psychological edge of fear, suddenly found themselves unsure, drawn into a killing zone by an enemy they underestimated. The Mamluk strategy relied heavily on mobility, timing, and discipline. Heavy cavalry charges were countered with coordinated flanking maneuvers, while archers rained volleys of arrows into advancing ranks. Baibars demonstrated extraordinary tactical insight, using terrain, timing, and deception to neutralize the Mongols' famed mobility. The Mongols, despite their reputation for encirclement tactics, found themselves ensnared in a trap of their own. Those who had charged forward were suddenly isolated, cut off from reinforcements, and surrounded by disciplined Mamluk formations. One of the most critical moments came when Sultan Qutuz led a decisive strike against the Mongol center, targeting command units and causing confusion. Mongol leaders were killed or wounded, further fracturing their army's cohesion. The famed Mongol psychological advantage, the aura of invincibility, was shattered. What had once been an unstoppable juggernaut was now disordered, retreating, and vulnerable. By the end of the day, the Mongols suffered a defeat they would never forget. Thousands lay dead, while others retreated across the desert, their aura of invincibility permanently tarnished. The implications of Ain Jalut were profound. This was the first major defeat of the Mongol army in open battle, proving that their advance could be halted. The Mamluks preserved the Islamic heartlands of Egypt and Syria, ensuring that Cairo and the broader Middle East would remain centers of culture, religion, and commerce. Had the Mongols continued unopposed, the entire region might have been incorporated into their empire, reshaping the course of Islamic civilization and altering trade, culture, and politics for centuries. Ain Jalut also illustrates the importance of leadership and preparation. The Mongols were tactically brilliant, but overextension and underestimation proved fatal. The Mamluks, disciplined and strategic, leveraged every advantage, demonstrating that even the most fearsome force can be defeated by foresight and courage. It was a battle not of numbers alone but of planning, morale, and adaptability. Yet, despite its significance, Ain Jalut remains less celebrated than battles like Hastings or Thermopylae. The Mongol advance dominates the popular imagination, with stories of horror and conquest overshadowing the decisive moments when their momentum was stopped. Ain Jalut was not merely a defensive victory, it was a turning point that shaped the destiny of an entire region, preserving cultures, political structures, and religious traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The human dimension adds further depth. Imagine soldiers on both sides, aware that the fate of empires rested on their actions. The Mamluks, former slaves who had risen through merit and skill, fought not only for survival but for the preservation of a civilization under threat. The Mongols, veterans of countless campaigns, faced an enemy that had learned to counter their most effective tactics. Dust, sweat, and blood mingled across the valley, every moment charged with uncertainty, fear, and resolve. Today, Ain Jalut is a quiet landscape, largely peaceful and unmarked, yet the echoes of battle linger. The Jordan Valley carries the memory of strategy, courage, and a clash that forever altered the Middle East. Ain Jalut reminds us that history is full of moments where the unstoppable is stopped, where courage and planning overcome brute force, and where the hidden battles of the past shape the civilizations of the present. In the end, Ain Jalut stands as a testament to the power of resilience, strategy, and the decisive influence of a single battle. It shows that even the mightiest forces can be halted, that leadership and preparation matter as much as numbers, and that history often remembers the invaders while quietly preserving the triumphs of those who resisted. Forgotten by the wider world but decisive for centuries, Ain Jalut was a turning point that secured the heart of the Middle East and shaped the destiny of nations. The year is 1242, and the icy waters of Lake Peipus stretch endlessly beneath a pale northern sun. In the middle of this frozen expanse, a decisive confrontation is about to unfold, one that will shape the future of Eastern Europe and halt the seemingly unstoppable advance of a powerful crusading order. On one side stand the Teutonic Knights, elite, heavily armored warriors, trained in siege and battlefield tactics, emboldened by years of expansion into pagan territories. On the other, the forces of Prince Alexander Nevsky, a young Russian leader whose determination, tactical ingenuity, and knowledge of the harsh terrain will turn the frozen lake into a stage of legendary conflict. The Baltic region in the early 13th century was a turbulent frontier. Christian crusading orders, particularly the Teutonic Knights, sought to extend their influence eastward, subjugating pagan and Orthodox Christian territories alike. Novgorod, the city-state under Alexander Nevsky, represented a key strategic and cultural stronghold. If the Teutonic Knights succeeded here, the balance of power in the north could shift dramatically, allowing Western Crusaders to dominate trade routes, religious institutions, and the political landscape of Eastern Europe. Nevsky's forces were significantly outnumbered, yet he understood that brute force alone would not win the day. Instead, he leveraged his intimate knowledge of the terrain, the frozen lake, and the weaknesses of heavily armored cavalry. The Teutonic Knights, confident in their steel, discipline, and reputation, advanced in traditional formation across the snow-covered fields and onto the frozen ice, expecting an easy victory against the smaller Russian force. The battle began with the knights pressing forward, their heavy armor clanking, their horses' hooves pounding the ice. At first, the advance seemed unstoppable. The Russians appeared to retreat, giving ground as if overwhelmed. But this was a calculated maneuver, a feigned withdrawal designed to lure the enemy onto the fragile ice. Nevsky's men held their formations in secret, positioning archers and infantry along the edges of the ice, ready to exploit the terrain at the perfect moment. As the heavily armored knights pushed deeper onto the lake, the ice began to betray them. Horses struggled on the slippery surface, and the concentrated weight of armored men created fractures. Nevsky's forces counterattacked with precision. Archers and infantry struck from flanks and rear, sowing confusion and panic. The knights, trapped on unstable ice, could neither maneuver effectively nor retreat safely. Horses and men alike fell into the freezing waters, many never to rise again. The lake became a frozen battlefield of chaos, steel, and death. The genius of Nevsky's strategy lay not only in terrain exploitation but in psychological warfare. The Teutonic Knights, elite and proud, were not accustomed to being outmaneuvered by a smaller, seemingly less experienced force. The panic spread quickly, morale collapsed, and the Russian forces pressed relentlessly. By the end of the engagement, the Teutonic advance had been decisively halted. Nevsky had achieved a stunning victory, ensuring that Novgorod and neighboring Russian territories remained free from Western Crusader domination. The implications of this battle were far-reaching. By stopping the Teutonic Knights, Nevsky secured the survival and autonomy of Russian lands in the north. Orthodox Christianity remained the dominant faith, culture and political independence were preserved, and the trajectory of Eastern European development continued without Western interference. Had the Knights succeeded, the region might have experienced centuries of Western European domination, altering language, religion, governance, and trade in ways that are difficult to fully imagine today. Despite its significance, the battle on the ice is rarely mentioned outside Russian historical narratives or specialized military studies. Unlike Thermopylae or Cannae, it lacks the romanticized narrative of heroic sacrifice against insurmountable odds, and yet it is equally decisive. The story is one of intelligence, preparation, and courage, where the environment itself becomes a weapon, and strategic foresight outweighs numerical or technological superiority. The human dimension adds further depth. Imagine the Teutonic Knights, armored and confident, slipping into freezing water, their cries drowned in the roar of the ice cracking beneath them. Picture Nevsky's soldiers, determined, disciplined, and focused, braving the bitter cold to defend their homeland. The battle is not only one of strategy and numbers but of endurance, courage, and adaptability in a landscape that few could master. Today, Lake Peipus flows quietly, its waters reflecting the northern sky, frozen only in the coldest months. Visitors might see fishermen or skaters where once men and horses struggled for survival on ice and snow. Yet the echoes of that day resonate through history. The battle on the ice demonstrates that geography, climate, and cunning can decide the fate of nations just as surely as numbers, courage, or steel. In the end, the battle stands as a testament to strategic brilliance, environmental mastery, and the decisive power of timing and insight. Nevsky's victory preserved a civilization, a culture, and a faith, halting the expansion of one of the most powerful military orders of the Middle Ages. Forgotten by much of the world, yet decisive for the future of Eastern Europe, the battle on the ice reminds us that history's hidden confrontations often determine the shape of entire regions for centuries to come. The year is 1529, and the city of Vienna stands as a bulwark at the edge of Europe. On the horizon, the banners of the Ottoman Empire ripple in the wind, carried by the cavalry and infantry of one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever seen. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, already famed for his conquests across the Middle East and North Africa, now turns his gaze toward Central Europe, intent on pushing the boundaries of his empire into the heart of the continent. What unfolds at Vienna is more than a battle, it is a clash of civilizations, a test of endurance, strategy, and the very will of a city to resist a seemingly unstoppable force. The Ottoman army, estimated at over 100,000 strong, is a meticulously organized force. Janissaries, elite infantry trained from youth, march with precision, cavalry sweep in for swift flanking maneuvers, artillery teams haul massive cannons across rough terrain to batter the city's walls. The city itself, defended by a significantly smaller force of Habsburg troops and local militias, numbers perhaps 20,000 men. Outnumbered 5-1, Vienna's defenders face what seems like inevitable defeat. Yet the advantage of fortifications, knowledge of terrain, and sheer resolve will prove decisive. The siege begins with relentless bombardment. Cannons roar, hurling stones and fire into the city's walls. Towers tremble under the weight of the assault, and the smoke and dust of destruction hang thick in the air. The Ottomans attempt to storm the gates, using ladders, scaling equipment, and sheer manpower, but every attack is repelled with desperate determination. Defenders throw boiling oil, hurl rocks, and fire arrows with lethal precision. Night after night, assaults are launched, each repelled with ingenuity and courage. Suleiman, confident in the inevitability of victory, underestimates the resilience of Vienna's citizens. The defenders, composed of professional soldiers and ordinary townspeople, endure hunger, disease, and exhaustion, yet refuse to surrender. Their walls become more than stone, they are symbols of resistance, resilience, and human will in the face of overwhelming odds. The Ottomans' famed cavalry charges, expected to crush the defenders quickly, are frustrated by the city's terrain, fortifications, and the defenders' tactical improvisations. Weather adds another layer to the drama. Autumn rains turn the surrounding fields into mud, slowing Ottoman movements and bogging down artillery. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers falter. Disease begins to sap the strength of the invaders. Each day that Vienna holds out compounds the logistical and psychological strain on the Ottoman forces. Time becomes an ally for the defenders, and a silent enemy for the attackers. The climax of the siege comes not in a single heroic charge but in the culmination of attrition and strategy. Suleiman's forces, despite their discipline and numbers, are unable to breach the walls decisively. With winter approaching and supply lines failing, he orders a retreat, a rare moment in a career marked by conquests. Vienna survives, intact but weary, a testament to the power of resilience, preparation, and strategic patience. The consequences of the siege are immense. Vienna's survival halts Ottoman expansion into Central Europe for decades, preserving the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the continent. Had the city fallen, the map of Europe might have been radically altered, with the Habsburgs weakened and the Ottomans gaining a foothold that could have shifted the balance of power across the continent. The siege's failure influences European military strategy, prompting fortification improvements, army reorganizations, and alliances aimed at resisting future Ottoman campaigns. Yet the siege of Vienna is often overshadowed in popular history by other European battles or Ottoman exploits. It lacks the romanticized imagery of Thermopylae or the cinematic heroism of Cannae, yet its importance is undeniable. The battle is a study in endurance, logistics, human will, and the decisive role of urban fortifications in early modern warfare. It demonstrates that even the most powerful armies can be checked, not only by superior firepower or numbers but by preparation, resilience, and strategic advantage. The human element of Vienna's defense adds a compelling dimension. Citizens, soldiers, and leaders alike share in the collective struggle. Fear, determination, and ingenuity intermingle as families huddle within the city walls, witnessing the terror of bombardment while contributing to defense efforts. Each arrow fired, each barricade reinforced, and each improvised defense embodies a refusal to surrender, a collective courage that tips the scales in favor of survival. Today, Vienna bears monuments and historical markers commemorating this dramatic siege, yet the human experience, the sweat, blood, and ingenuity of those who defended the city, remains largely hidden behind the stone walls and centuries of history. The siege serves as a reminder that decisive moments often unfold quietly, through endurance, discipline, and the will to resist, rather than through singular acts of heroism alone. In the end, the Siege of Vienna is a testament to the power of resilience and strategy against overwhelming force. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by conquest but by survival, not only by invaders but by those who refuse to yield. Vienna's walls held, and with them, the course of European history was preserved, proving that even in the face of seemingly unstoppable power, determination, preparation, and tactical acumen can change the fate of nations. June 18, 1815. The rolling fields of modern-day Belgium are shrouded in early morning mist. A sense of tension hangs in the air, thick as the damp fog, as thousands of soldiers prepare for a battle that will decide not just the fate of empires, but the future of Europe itself. Napoleon Bonaparte, recently returned from exile on Elba, has amassed an army determined to reclaim his glory and reshape the continent. Opposing him are the Allied forces, a coalition of British, Dutch, Belgian, and Prussian troops under the leadership of the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher. What unfolds at Waterloo will become a defining moment in military history, the final chapter of Napoleon's ambitions. Napoleon, the master strategist, relies on a combination of rapid maneuvers, psychological warfare, and precise timing. His forces, though seasoned and motivated, face challenges: muddy terrain caused by relentless rain, delays in communication, and the pressure of acting before the Allies can consolidate their positions. The battlefield is uneven, with ridges, farmhouses, and hedgerows shaping tactics. Every landscape feature becomes both an obstacle and an opportunity, influencing the movement of men, artillery, and cavalry. The battle begins with an artillery exchange that shakes the land. French cannons roar, sending shrapnel and cannonballs across the fields, while Allied batteries respond with disciplined accuracy. Infantry units advance under the cover of smoke, moving toward enemy positions with disciplined precision. French attacks initially focus on the farm of Hougoumont, a stronghold of the Allies' right flank. Hours of ferocious combat follow, with repeated French assaults met by stubborn resistance. The farm becomes a symbol of Allied tenacity, and its defense plays a critical role in preventing Napoleon from breaking Wellington's line. Midday brings the cavalry into focus. French cuirassiers charge across the mud, seeking to crush infantry and create openings for infantry to exploit. Yet Wellington's troops, disciplined and strategically deployed, absorb the attacks, forming squares, tight formations that repel cavalry with deadly efficiency. Horses and men clash on the wet fields, armor glinting against the gray sky, soldiers' cries mingling with the thunder of artillery. The battle is not just a test of numbers, but of courage, coordination, and adaptability under relentless pressure. The decisive moment comes in the late afternoon, as the Prussian army under Blücher begins to arrive on Napoleon's right flank. Napoleon, overextended and struggling to maintain cohesion, faces attacks from two directions. The combined pressure of Prussian reinforcements and the steadfast Allied center stretches French forces beyond their limits. Napoleon's strategy of rapid strikes and decisive engagement falters under the weight of coordinated opposition. Exhausted, muddy, and under relentless fire, French morale begins to waver. Napoleon himself moves among his troops, attempting to rally men and coordinate attacks. The human element is starkly visible: soldiers exhausted by hours of combat, artillery crews struggling through mud, officers shouting orders above the din of gunfire. Yet leadership alone cannot compensate for the combination of terrain, weather, and overwhelming opposition. By evening, French formations collapse under the dual assault, and retreat becomes inevitable. Napoleon's final gambit has failed. The consequences of Waterloo are monumental. Napoleon is forced into permanent exile on the remote island of St. Helena, ending an era of nearly constant European conflict led by one man. The Congress of Vienna, already shaping post-Napoleonic Europe, can now enforce its vision of balance and stability without fear of renewed French domination. Borders are redrawn, monarchies restored, and Europe enters a century-long period of relative peace. The battle shapes not only political boundaries but the military and strategic thinking of generations to come. Waterloo is also a study in the interplay of leadership, timing, and circumstance. Napoleon's brilliance is undeniable, yet his overconfidence, the mud, and the coordination of Allied forces reveal that even the greatest tactical mind can be undone by environmental and strategic factors. Wellington's defense, combined with Blücher's timely arrival, illustrates the decisive impact of coalition warfare and the importance of resilience, coordination, and patience. The human dimension of Waterloo is staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers fight, bleed, and die on fields that will soon return to peaceful farmland. The cries of the wounded, the chaos of cavalry charges, and the smoke of countless cannon shots create a tableau of desperation and heroism. Ordinary soldiers, many conscripts, find themselves at the mercy of larger historical forces, their courage and suffering largely anonymous, yet integral to the outcome. Today, the fields of Waterloo are tranquil, dotted with monuments and memorials, yet the echoes of cannon fire, the hoofbeats of cavalry, and the cries of combat still linger in the historical imagination. The battle serves as a reminder that history is often decided not just by the most famous leaders, but by ordinary individuals, the environment, and the precise timing of events. In the end, the Battle of Waterloo stands as a testament to the limits of ambition, the power of coordination, and the profound impact of decisive moments. Napoleon's final gambit reshaped Europe, ending one era and ushering in another. Forgotten by time in the human suffering it caused, yet decisive for the fate of nations, Waterloo exemplifies how single battles can pivot the trajectory of empires, leaving legacies that reverberate for centuries. The Second World War had engulfed the globe by 1942, and the Eastern Front was a theater of unimaginable scale and brutality. In the southern Soviet Union, the city of Stalingrad, an industrial hub on the Volga River, became the focal point of one of the most ferocious battles in human history. Adolf Hitler, seeking to secure oil fields in the Caucasus and break Soviet morale, ordered his forces to capture the city. Joseph Stalin, determined to defend the namesake city and maintain Soviet prestige, marshaled every available resource. What followed was a battle of attrition, endurance, and human suffering on a scale rarely seen in the annals of warfare. The German Sixth Army, seasoned and confident, advanced toward Stalingrad with mechanized units, heavy artillery, and air support. Initial attacks reduced large portions of the city to rubble, with buildings, factories, and homes collapsing under bombardment. Yet the Soviet defenders, composed of Red Army soldiers, militia, and civilians, refused to yield. Each street, building, and factory became a fortress, a trap, and a battleground. Snipers, machine gunners, and artillery teams turned the ruins into deadly choke points, ensuring that every advance would be met with fierce resistance. Urban warfare at Stalingrad was unlike conventional battles. Tanks maneuvered through debris-laden streets, infantry engaged in brutal room-to-room combat, and snipers preyed on soldiers from shattered windows and crumbling rooftops. The city itself became a weapon and a trap, ruins funneled movements, obstructed visibility, and magnified the horrors of combat. Soldiers fought not in open fields but in claustrophobic, ever-changing urban mazes where the enemy could appear from any angle. Casualties mounted on both sides, yet neither could claim decisive control for months. The battle also exposed the extremes of human endurance and suffering. Soldiers faced freezing winters, inadequate supplies, and relentless artillery barrages. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion were as deadly as bullets and shells. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, many conscripted into support roles or forced to flee ruins on foot under shellfire. The psychological toll was immense. Men were constantly on edge, anticipating sudden attacks, ambushes, or collapse of defensive positions. Yet the resolve to hold or take each building, street, and factory never wavered. Strategically, Stalingrad was as much about willpower as about maneuver. German commanders underestimated Soviet resilience and overextended supply lines across harsh winter terrain. Soviet forces, under Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, used the city's geography and urban chaos to their advantage. They launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army, cutting off reinforcements and supplies, and turning what had been an offensive into a trap. German troops, trapped and freezing, found themselves isolated and increasingly desperate, unable to break the Soviet cordon. The battle's climax came in January 1943, when the encircled German forces, weakened by starvation, frostbite, and relentless attacks, were forced to surrender. Nearly 91,000 troops were captured, including generals and high-ranking officers, while tens of thousands died before capitulation. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II, halting the German advance into the Soviet Union and shifting the strategic initiative firmly into Allied hands. The psychological and symbolic impact was enormous. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The human cost of Stalingrad is staggering. Estimates suggest nearly 2 million casualties, including soldiers and civilians, making it one of the bloodiest battles in recorded history. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated, leaving the city almost entirely destroyed. Survivors faced trauma, starvation, and the monumental task of rebuilding their lives and their city from ruins. Yet amidst this destruction, acts of heroism, endurance, and solidarity emerged, demonstrating both the cruelty and resilience of humanity in war. Stalingrad also serves as a stark example of how modern warfare evolved. Urban combat, combined arms coordination, psychological warfare, and logistical planning all played pivotal roles. Commanders had to adapt to fluid, chaotic conditions where traditional strategies often failed. The battle demonstrated the decisive power of attrition and encirclement in modern military doctrine, lessons studied in military academies to this day. Despite the horror, the Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as a symbol of resilience, strategic ingenuity, and the unyielding will to survive. It exemplifies how a single city, reduced to rubble and despair, became the turning point of a global conflict. Ordinary soldiers, conscripted citizens, and leaders alike shaped the outcome, their courage and endurance leaving an indelible mark on history. Today, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, bears memorials, monuments, and museums commemorating the battle. The Mamiev Kurgan, topped with the towering statue Motherland Calls, overlooks the city, a stark reminder of the sacrifices endured. Yet beneath the grandeur of memorials, the ruins and scars of battle echo the intensity, despair, and heroism that defined those months. In the end, the Battle of Stalingrad stands as a testament to the extremities of war and the pivotal moments that decide the fate of nations. It highlights the interplay of strategy, resilience, and human endurance in shaping history. Forgotten in the sense of its day-to-day horrors, yet decisive for the outcome of World War II and the global balance of power, Stalingrad reminds us that history is often written in blood, endurance, and the unyielding will of those who refuse to surrender, even when all seems lost.